Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on March 12, 2025. Mark Carney has won Canada's Liberal Party leadership contest in a landslide. In winning the leadership, Carney garnered a whopping 87% of the popular vote. The second place finisher was Chrystia Freeland. In my recent interview of John Helmer, I expressed the view that Freeland was simply unelectable. Apparently, that was the assessment of many liberals. Freeland garnered a mere 7% of the popular vote, and she suffered this ignominious defeat after triggering the demise of Justin Trudeau by resigning from his cabinet and publicly chastising the prime minister. But is Mark Carney likely to be better for Canada than Justin Trudeau? Carney is poised to replace Trudeau as prime minister, even though he has no seat in Canada's parliament. As is well known, Carney is an elite banker who has never held elected office. For 13 years, Mark Carney worked at Goldman Sachs and climbed the corporate ladder. When he left Goldman in 2003, he had risen to the level of managing director for investment banking. I know Goldman Sachs well from my time working as an attorney on Wall Street, and I can assure you that bankers who occupy those positions at Goldman make gobs of money. In 2003, Carney left Goldman Sachs to become deputy governor of the Bank of Canada. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, during which time the great financial crisis struck. Like all the central bankers in the West, he helped to save the big banks from their own greed and recklessness. In 2013, Carney became governor of the Bank of England and remained in that position until 2020. At the time of his appointment to the Bank of England, Britain's prime minister was Conservative David Cameron. Carney served as governor of the Bank of England under two other Conservative prime ministers, Theresa May, and at the end of his tenure as Bank of England governor, Boris Johnson. After leaving the Bank of England, Carney secured lucrative gigs on the boards of Brookfield Asset Management and Stripe. Yesterday, we got a hint of what a campaign Mark Carney is likely to run in the soon-to-be-called Canadian federal election. On X, Carney put out a statement about Israel's use of starvation as a weapon of war. In his post, Carney said that the supply of electricity to Gaza, quote, must resume, that essentials including food, electricity, and medical supplies should never be used as political tools, and that, quote, Canada must work with our allies to stand up for international law. Now, numerous supporters of Palestine reacted positively to this statement. Frankly, I'm having difficulty understanding why. Because after all, we've seen this shtick before. One liberal leader after another has expressed tepid support for Palestinian human rights while doing nothing concrete to hold Israel accountable for violating them. Did Carney indicate that he would impose an arms embargo? Did he mention economic sanctions on Israel? Did he say that Canada would prosecute Canadian Israelis who participate in Israel's genocidal war on the Palestinian people? No, he said none of these things, nor unfortunately, is he likely to do so? On the contrary, Carney has reportedly appointed former Liberal MP Marco Mendicino as his chief of staff. And during his many years in Canada's parliament, Mendicino was one of Canada's most aggressive advocates for Israel. Indeed, by any rational measure, Mendicino is a fanatical Zionist. But I digress. Today, we're going to focus on Carney's economic record. We're also going to talk about the mess Carney left behind him when he departed the United Kingdom. To unpack all of this, I'm very pleased to be joined again by Costas Lapavitsas. Costas is a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He was elected as a member of the Hellenic Parliament for the Syriza party in January 2015. In the election, Syriza ran on a platform of opposition to austerity. In the summer of 2015, after former Greek PM Alexis Tsipras capitulated to the demands for new and harsher austerity from Greece's troika of creditors, Costas defected from Syriza to a new left-wing party. Thank you very much for joining me today, Costas.
It's my pleasure, Dimitri. I look forward to our discussion.
So I'm going to start by throwing it open with a big picture question about Carney's 7-year tenure as the governor of the Bank of England. How do you assess that tenure from an economic management perspective, from his management of the financial system? Any aspects of it that you think might be relevant to assessing over here in Canada what kind of a prime minister he's likely to be?
Let me first of all say that Mark Carney is very much a product of financialized capitalism, the financialized capitalism we've experienced the last few decades. He's a typical example of a capable person who rises from a middle-class background and becomes the voice of financialized interest, and expresses it as systematically and coherently as his intellectual capacities allow him to. Um, he's very much a product of the machine. Let's put it that way. He's a characteristic product of the machine that has populated political systems across the West for about 3 decades now. In that regard, he is entirely undistinguished as a political leader and entirely undistinguished, really, as a high functionary. His tenure at the Bank of England can only be described as dull. I mean, if you ask British people, they barely recorded his name. He's barely remembered in this country. His impact is negligible. So he was the governor of the Bank of England from 2013 until 2020. That was the time of really, in a sense, the harshest Tory austerity governments that we've had. He was selected by George Osborne, who was the prime architect of the disastrous austerity policies that the Tories followed in this country back in that decade.
Osborne was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under David Cameron, if I have that right.
He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under David Cameron. Osborne is the man who basically organized austerity in this country throughout the decade of the 2010s, that disastrous policy. Carney was his choice, and he governed the Bank of England during that period. And as I said, his tenure is entirely undistinguished. He barely noticed what he did. In terms of his practical policies, in terms of what he actually did, he followed the standard prescriptions of the central banking of his time. There was no originality or anything different. He basically expanded the money supply. He followed quantitative easing. He made for low interest rates to facilitate the profit making of the financial system, and the quantitative easing policies that he also applied were still aimed at supporting the balance sheets of the financial system and the profits of the financial system. He's basically the voice. He was the voice and the lever of profitability for the financial system in this country for 7 years. He did that to a certain extent when the pandemic also hit. He was at the helm for a short period of time, and he followed pretty much the same policies that also were applied after him. And he saw to it that the financial system continued to make significant profits and turn the corner. That was basically it as far as Bank of England governor. Nothing really to set him aside, to show that he had any originality, any kind of special skills or special powers or special capabilities. He's a forgettable person.
Right. And now when he was the governor of the Bank of England, there were 2 events that happened that will not be forgotten anytime soon. There were really earthquakes in the European Union. The first one was in 2015, and as you and I have discussed many times in prior interviews, Greece's troika of creditors, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF inflicted upon the Greek people a vicious austerity program after they voted overwhelmingly to reject Greece's creditors' austerity demands. At that point in time, Britain was still a member of the EU. Now, that was one of the earthquakes. Shortly after that, we had Brexit, which is a seminal event in EU, in European affairs. To what extent did the Bank of England under Carney's helm play any meaningful role in either of those politically definitive moments?
For the first set of events, that of the Greek crisis and what happened, the Bank of England was really very much a secondary player. The real decision making was made in in Germany, actually by the ECB, the European Central Bank, and in Germany, the Bundesbank, fundamentally. So his role, Carney's role, and the Bank of England's role was very much secondary. He didn't really play much of a role in the Greek affair. On Brexit, however, things are different. Carney came out against Brexit. He voiced the dominant liberal view. So don't forget, in this country, the Brexit support came from the right wing of the Tory party, who actually, in terms of economics and so on, they weren't that dramatically different from the liberal wing of the rest of the political regime, but nonetheless, they were conservative in outlook. So it came from them, and it came from the working class and the poor, who were in favor of Brexit as a matter of democracy. And as a matter of reacting against the policies that had been followed by the liberal elite in this country for a very long time. Carney, true to his liberal outlook, came out against that. He came out in a sort of undemocratic way, because obviously the British people had voted for him. And he criticized openly. He expected a recession to follow Brexit, which he didn't do. I mean, there was no recession after Brexit. He expected a disaster, a catastrophe, which didn't happen. He kept coming out against Brexit, and he attracted a lot of criticism from the right wing of the Tory party during that time. That was what he is remembered for, nothing else. He was not right in terms of the immediate impact of Brexit. Many people now say, or several people now say, oh, he was right because Brexit has not succeeded. But the impact of Brexit has not been positive, or he has not delivered. Brexit has not delivered what he was supposed to deliver, because the government policies after Brexit were what they were. So they were not positive. So it wasn't Brexit per se that didn't work out. It was the government policies after Brexit that didn't work out. So his economic acumen doesn't really strike me as particularly sharp. And what he said on Brexit was not right when he said it. He didn't succeed. So he's very much a standard. His is very much the standard outlook of the liberal elite that has brought us to this terrible pass across the West the last few years.
Now, if I recall correctly, Costas, just for the edification of our viewers, back in 2015, my understanding is your position has not fundamentally changed on this. You were an advocate of a different type of exit, a Grexit. So you would have been on the other side of this debate from Carney, and still are, as I understand. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, Carney's opposition to Brexit and defense of the monetary union, even if England was not in the monetary union, but Carney defended the union when he had to. The monetary union. Carney's defense of membership of the EU and the common currency, insofar as he had to say on that, is very much a reflection of the standard outlook, the conservative outlook, which presents itself as liberal, but actually is conservative. It says that the world has reached the perfect state, and we need to keep it that way. If you really wanted to change things, if you wanted to move society in a direction of better conditions for working people, better employment, rising living standards, more justice, more equality, and so on, you had to break with that all these structures. That's what Grexit was about. Grexit was not simply a technical thing. Let's get Greece out of the monetary union to have a depreciation of the currency and then export more. These are technical things. The real thing was, let's get out of this framework that is throttling the country. That's what we wanted to do. Let's shift the balance in favor of working people and against big business. Carney was on the other side. Let's keep everything the way it is because big business likes it, and I will give it a liberal sheen. I will give it a liberal cover.
Right. So let's talk about a specific issue that has arisen already under Carney's tenure as the leader of the Liberal Party, because I think I actually regard this as a very significant issue from the perspective of the distribution of wealth, extremely significant in Canada. But I think it also gives us a flavor of what we might expect from Mark Carney in the days ahead. And that is the Liberals announced a plan months ago and delayed the plan repeatedly, by the way, to increase modestly the taxation of capital gains in Canada, which for a very long time have been taxed much more favorably than employment income. Under the Liberals' plan, capital gains would have continued to receive considerably more favorable tax treatment than employment income, but at least the disparity between the levels of taxation of these two types of economic gain would have been reduced somewhat. Now that Carney has won, the media is reporting dutifully that the Liberals' modest capital gains taxation reform is almost certainly dead. And the commentariat, the economic experts, as they characterize them, who are being platformed in the media, who are being asked to chime in on the wisdom of this tax reform, are uniformly of the view that it was a bad idea, that it was going to, if it had been enacted, it was going to deter investment, particularly in the Canadian technology sector. So, Costas, what is the conventional rationale for taxing capital gains at a lower rate than employment income? Do you think that rationale makes sense? And what kind of a policy do you think Mark Carney should pursue with respect to capital gains if he's truly interested in dealing with the increasingly severe problem of inequality in Canada?
I am no great expert on the Canadian tax system, right? Let me just say that at the outset. And tax systems differ from country to country. One has to have specific knowledge in order to make concrete proposals. But I do understand how tax works on capital gains and how tax works on income, because that's common across the world. Now, if, as you say, Carney is proposing to abolish even a fairly mild taxation of capital gains, that would fit very nicely with his liberal outlook. Taxing capital gains is basically a tax on unearned income, unearned profits made by financial asset holders and often by big businesses who hold financial assets. It's entirely unearned. You earn it because prices move in your direction, in your favor, and suddenly you've got these profits on paper, which you can translate into real cash if you sell your asset. This is the main mechanism of enrichment of the top 1%, the famous 1%. This has been the main mechanism of enrichment of the top 1% the last several decades. It's a characteristic aspect of financialized capitalism. This is how the very rich make their profits and earn the fabulous amounts of money that they earn. It isn't actually profits from production, profits from investment, profits from being actively engaged in producing new things. Typically, it's profits from holding financial assets and benefiting from shifts in price, which are often manipulated by the central bank. When the central bank changes the rate of interest, then it causes changes in financial asset prices, and some layers of these people make huge profits as a result. The same happens with public debt. The main function of public debt is precisely this, is to create profits, huge unearned profits for those who hold the public debt. This is a very well-known, very old thing in capitalism. In our days, the days of financialized capitalism, it's become the main lever of enrichment of a very tiny layer of people at the top of society who are richer beyond our wildest imaginings. The rich today are richer than at any other time in human history. And the main lever of this enrichment is capital gains. You should have no doubt at all about it. Now, taxing it is manifestly beneficial to society. It hasn't been earned. It's unearned income. Basically taking it from out of someone's pocket and putting it into yours. Taxing it is manifestly a sensible thing to do for the perspective of the economy and a fair thing to do. It is fundamental to fairness and justice. Taxing it less than income is terrible policy, because taxing income means taxing effort and taxing activity. Taxing unearned income, less than earned income through work is terrible. Not taxing unearned income is deadly, right? It is deadly. So it's a very bad policy. And the idea that it would detract from investment, it would stop investment, it is the commonest and oldest excuse. I've had it up to here with this. The number of times I've heard it about all these people who are waiting to bring all this money in and start, a revolution in production and jobs and so on, but they're being held back by unfair tax. Who? The people who don't pay at all their fair share of tax in society.
Right.
That's all I have to say. And if I sound aggravated about it, is because I'm aggravated about it. Not taxing capital gains is a deadly thing to do for the economy and for distribution and social justice.
So Canada, on a different question that is of primary importance to Canadians right now, as we discussed on a prior episode or two, Canada is now confronted by multiple and quite severe tariff threats from the Trump administration, which is causing tremendous anxiety in Canada, in the capital markets as well, both in Canada and outside of Canada. And understandably, it's causing anxiety because for decades, successive Liberal and Conservative governments in Canada have promoted Canada's increasing economic dependence on the United States. Given his record, how do you think Carney is likely to respond to these tariff threats? And do you think that his likely response is the right one? Or if not, how do you think a Prime Minister Carney, if he actually ascends to that position, should respond to these tariff threats?
I read his statements, and I actually saw him in the clips that were available on the internet deliver those statements to when he won the nomination, and next, as he will be the next prime minister. So his statements were quite hard sounding, that he will take a hard position and that he will respond with tariffs to American tariffs. In some ways, he's playing to the gallery, isn't he? I mean, Trump's tariff positions, policies, and his statements about Canada have obviously touched the raw nerve with the Canadian people, and they've given a lease of life to the Liberal Party, which had been practically dead on its feet for such a long time. And Carney reflects that, and he's got to reflect it because he feels that that's how he's going to get votes. Now, is that the best strategy? And what is the best strategy for Canada? Tariffs typically generate counter tariffs. So in that regard, Carney is not saying anything particularly different. The Chinese have imposed their own tariffs to react to Trump's tariffs. The European Union is imposing its own tariffs. Mexico is keeping quiet for the moment, hoping to avoid the worst. And Carney says that he will impose counter tariffs, and Canada is going to respond in that way. Is that sensible or is it not? In the case of Canada and in the case of Mexico, what complicates things greatly is something we've mentioned in our previous discussions, which is much of what is exported to the United States from Canada and from Mexico is actually produced by American enterprises. This trade is not trade between Canadian producers and US consumers only. It's also intra-enterprise flows of commodities because production has become globalized. And Canada is part and parcel of this through the NAFTA agreements and through the agreements that they've been signed with Trump previously. So it complicates things greatly, countering tariffs with tariffs, and it complicates things for Trump himself. Now, what's the significance of that for Canadian policy? Responding to tariffs with tariffs doesn't really solve anything. It will be done. It's inevitable. but it doesn't really solve anything. Actually, what Trump policies show is the failure precisely of this open-bordered approach, precisely of the policy that says, bring your enterprises to Canada, produce here more cheaply than you would have done in the United States, and send the goods back to the United States. That's what's come to an end. It is this. And if Carney wants to follow a policy that means something for the Canadian people, he's got to break with that. It isn't simply imposing tariffs to counter Trump's tariffs. It is actually devising a strategy and a policy that will focus on domestic production, domestic demand, good employment, and high wages for people, which pivots on domestic demand becoming stronger. In other words, Trump is signaling the end of a period in which capital could move across borders, produce across borders, and send goods across borders freely. If that's the case, then economic policy has to be redesigned to focus on the domestic market. And Carney is not equipped to do that. Carney is a product of the previous liberal elite. Carney doesn't think that way. He thinks in the way the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. That's gone. That's past the days.
And Costas, I must say, I've heard absolutely nothing in Carney's rhetoric to suggest that he understands this and that he has any in-depth understanding of how to deal with this problem. It's just, let's retaliate. Whether or not that's a short-term measure that ought to be pursued, it's not going to deal with the problem on a long-term basis. And he simply doesn't seem to have any grasp of that at all.
That's pretty much what I'm saying. That he says, let's retaliate. And they will retaliate. And in a sense, that's inevitable when you've got tariffs. But that's not the issue. The issue is that we've had a system shift, right? That's what's happening. That's the significance. Put it differently, we've discussed it before in our meetings that there might not be logic in what Trump is doing, right? There might not be system in it. It's impossible to detect it because the man makes one decision one morning and another decision in the next morning, right? He raises taxes to tariffs to 50%, then brings them down to 25%. That's not serious in terms of policy. That's true. However, he's signaling the end of a period, in the end of a time. That's really the importance of it. And retaliating on tariffs is not really a good enough policy. What is required now is rethinking economic policy altogether for Canada and for Mexico, as it happens, and repositioning those countries next to the monster that's called the United States, of course. I mean, the United States is a vast economy, and that imposes its own constraints. But rethinking is imperative for Canada right now.
Right. So since we're on the subject of this monstrous economy south of the Canadian border, there's been an enormous shift in the corporate media's discourse about the U.S. economy the last few weeks. It's been quite something to behold. I'm going to read to you one headline in CNN, how the U.S. economy went from booming to a recession scare in only 20 days. And you can see headlines like this all over the place. When Trump won the election, they were corking open the champagne bottles on Wall Street, deregulation, lower taxes, let the good times roll. The forecasts were for robust growth in the U.S. economy. Nobody really, I don't think Trump has done anything that he didn't signal he was going to do. He was talking up tariffs incessantly during the campaign. He said, I'm Mr. Tariff. I love it. It's my favorite word in the English language. So why all of a sudden, Costas, has there been this massive shift in sentiment about the near and medium-term prospects of the U.S. economy, in your opinion?
Because the U.S. economy was never nearly as strong as people made out. You and I have discussed this. And actually, within a very short period of time, it's been shown to be true. We discussed it a few weeks ago, that basically all this talk about a productivity miracle in the United States, not all of it, most of this talk was hot air. It was hot air by people who barely looked at the figures and barely compared the figures to previous decades, and then simply reproduced all this stuff that's been emanating from fundamentally financial corporations, financial businesses, which were caught up in this bubble in the stock market. So if you've got a bubble in the stock market, everything seems lovely. you're making profits, your prices are going up. Capitalism is wonderful. The world is wonderful because obviously your profits on paper are increasing. So what's wrong with it? Everything is rosy. So if everything is rosy in the stock market, then everything must be rosy in the real economy. That's how these people think. And it doesn't take long from there to go into an argument about some kind of productivity miracle, some kind of exceptionalism of the United States in terms of its flexibility, then to begin to talk about eurosclerosis, all that. I mean, anybody who's been following these things for as long as I have, he recognizes the patterns, right? And basically, that's what we had as Trump was coming to the presidency and after he took over. Marvelous. And then it turns out that it's not so marvelous. And it's not so marvelous because Trump's actions on tariffs are incoherent, like you said. He is also signaling a change of times and a change of period, and that doesn't sit very well with the financial interest. What's happening? The financial interest doesn't like surprises. It likes everything to move the way it wants it to be. So Trump does that, and he catches people unawares. And crucially, DeepSeek emerges. People forget that. And most of the bubble that we've been talking about in the stock market has been pivoting around big tech. That's basically what's been driving it. Attracting capital from abroad on the prospects of huge profits that presumably will be made by AI, big tech, and all these huge monopolists who dominate that sector and much of the world economy. It turns up, and it turns out that the profitability prospects of a lot of these enterprises maybe are not that wonderful. And all that talk about, the boom, profits that to come and so on, maybe it was just talk. So it doesn't take long for the prices of all these tech businesses to fall. They've chalked up the sharpest falls. So stock market bubble seems to be coming to an end. Tech businesses are not doing so well. And then in that context, Trump adds instability about tariffs and what it might mean and so on. And gradually, afterwards, the world doesn't look so profitable anymore. So what you get is concern. What's going to happen? Well, yeah, what's going to happen? The underlying weakness of the United States economy has come to the fore because the underlying economy is weak. That's the truth of it. Productivity is not rising very fast. Profitability is not very great if the state doesn't support it. If it is high, it's because the state supports it. Investment is not that great. And the ability of US enterprises to compete globally is not that, it's not what people imagine. On top of that, it turns out that state finances are problematic, 7% deficit on the fiscal side. And the overall debt of the United States public sector is around about $36 trillion, 40% of which is owned abroad. That's not a strong economy. That's an economy that survives on its ability to attract capital from abroad and its ability to defend the dollar as world money. If that is ever in doubt, then the true weakness of the US economy emerges in full earnest. That's what's happening at the moment.
Right. So let's talk about the other economy in the Anglo-American Empire, namely the economy of Britain and how it's fared in the post-Carney years. The statistics that I managed to come up with, and you may have a different understanding of the performance of the economy. If so, please correct me. But the UK's economy grew, I understand, by a mere 0.9% in 2024. After a growth rate of 0.4% in 2023, the British government's budget deficit was £61 billion in 2023-24, equivalent to 2.2% of GDP. And the government's current debt to GDP ratio, I understand, is more or less at 100%. And ostensibly, to deal with the growing indebtedness of the United Kingdom, the Starmer government is pursuing what can fairly be described as a highly unpopular austerity program, including welfare cuts, and even reductions in benefits for the disabled. When I look at all of this, Costas, as a non-economist, what I see is that Britain has entered a period of prolonged economic decline. Maybe decline is too strong a word. Maybe stagnation is a better assessment of the situation. What is your take on the state of the British economy, and why does it appear to be so sick?
Britain is in deep, deep trouble. British capitalism is facing a truly profound and historic crisis at the moment. It's basically the failure of the previous historical shift, the one that was made by Margaret Thatcher. She transformed the British capitalism 40 years ago, put it on a certain trajectory and a path, privatization, liberalization, favoring capital against labor. That's come to an end. The ability of that to deliver has come to an end. And Britain has to do something different, and it doesn't know what. Now, this has been made much worse by policies that have been common across the developed world, especially the West, and in the United States and in Canada, since the great financial crisis of 2007, 2009. This is a crucial importance. You see, that crisis was a landmark event for Britain, but also for the entire West. It was a landmark event because it signaled the end of, in a sense, of successful financialization. So to respond to the crisis, that's the only thing I want to mention here, states intervened and saved the situation for big business. And they intervened by creating money, essentially, expanding public debt, spending money, right? Expanding public debt and financing that public debt by creating money. It was a move on two fronts. The state borrows, the central bank buys the debt and creates liquidity, creates money. Quantitative easing, which I mentioned already for Carney, right? As you do that, the outcome is you increase the total volume of debt. I've already mentioned that total volume of debt in the case of the United States is 36 trillion, right? That's enormous. And 50%, that increased by 50% since 2020. Biden really opened the sluices, right? The sluice gates, right? Is similar in this country. The 100% debt relative to GDP that you mentioned, a large part of that was created since 2020, and the biggest part since 2008. This is modern capitalism. Contemporary, globalized, and financialized capitalism is inconceivable without the state. The state is behind it, the state supports it, and the state does so by creating money and borrowing. So we've got a situation of vast state indebtedness in Britain, but also, of course, in the United States, as we mentioned. So here we are. The British economy is, like you pointed out, it's an economy that has got very weak investment, very weak profitability, very weak productivity growth, non-existent productivity growth, and very weak growth altogether. Now, capitalism without growth is a very dangerous thing. Capitalism is predicated on growth, right? Growth in the sense that the capitalists understand it. If there is no growth, it's very dangerous because incomes stagnate, poverty emerges in a big way, society doesn't function. Society begins to accumulate tension. That's what's happening here, right? That's what's happening in this country because we've had no growth for ages. Real incomes have taken a huge blow, right? Real wages have been stagnant for 10 years in this country, effectively, right? So real incomes have taken a huge blow. And here is the Labour Party being elected after this disaster essentially created by the Tories and promising to do things somehow different. Okay? They had all these plans, green growth. And it turns out that they abandoned the largest part of all that. And they're shifting towards austerity because they want use the debt. They want to contain the debt. They want to bring debt to what they think are more manageable levels. In other words, they will put pressure on working people after 10 years of sustained pressure altogether as far as the income is concerned. It's a very dangerous path for people to take, and it will have political repercussions for sure. On top of that, our Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has decided that we've got to rearm, and we're going to increase arms expenditure, possibly towards 5% of GDP. I'd like to see him do that. I'd like to see him achieve that in the situation in which I outlined.
And if I might, Kostas, I just want to put some meat on those bones. Figures published by the previous Conservative government in April 2024 forecast that the United Kingdom's what is called the NATO qualified defense expenditure. So this is, I understand, what the NATO brass would consider as qualifying military expenditures. So the Conservative government forecast in April 2024 it would be 64.6 billion pounds in 2024-25, which was expected to amount to 2.32% of GDP, up from 2.28%. This is barely moved at all. Now, so a 5% of GDP expenditure would require the United Kingdom government to more than double its current military expenditure of about 65 billion pounds. So with that sort of as background, I mean, is there any prospect whatsoever of the UK, given its current economic and fiscal situation, getting even remotely close to the 5% of GDP threshold?
Absolutely none at all. This is just hot air. Like much of this talk about rearming Europe and so on in the here and now, from Britain and from France too. This is just hot air. It's like this for Britain. It is, as you say, about 65 billion pounds. That's the dollars, the equivalent. This is what Britain spends on arms. I'll come to the particulars on arms in a minute, but it's about this much. But there is the equivalent of full employment in this country. In other words, there isn't very much spare capacity in terms of labor power. It's not very good jobs, right? They're bad jobs, but jobs there are. People are employed by and large. We don't have large numbers of unemployed people sitting around waiting for something to do, right? They work. As I repeat, bad jobs, McDonald's and the gig economy to a large extent, but jobs nonetheless. If Starmer is to increase military expenditure to 5% and produce the equivalent, in economic terms, leave the money aside. In economic terms, what would have to happen is that resources will have to be shifted from the peace economy to the war economy, because there is no spare capacity. There are no spare resources that can be mobilized to expand war production without touching upon peace production. This just doesn't exist. So he will have to shift resources from whatever Britain produces on an annual basis for people to live and to trade and so on, towards war. How will he do that? What will that entail? It will entail cutting welfare dramatically. It will entail cutting expenditure on infrastructure, and it will also entail reducing real wages. And the way in which this is likely to happen is nominal wages will be pushed up because there's no unemployment, so people will be employed in the war sector, but prices will rise even faster because supply will not be able to meet their needs because there's no spare capacity. This is classic in war economies, classic. So the British people will be confronted with a terrible situation if we go down that path. They'll be shifting resources towards the war economy. They'll be reducing real wages. In other words, people will not be able to spend. Goods will become expensive, and they will never be meeting the 5% target because it's too high. The country hasn't got the capacity. It's a fool's errand as far as Britain is concerned. It's a fool's errand, and that's without even going into what constitutes the military capacity of Britain right now, which is laughable, right? Laughable. God knows what that 65 billion has been going towards, because if you add the tanks, Britain barely has 30 tanks. If you add the aircraft, Britain has fewer aircraft than Greece does. Military.
Yeah, I understand you could get its whole army into a football stadium too.
You can get it into Wembley and you will have empty seats.
Right.
And even when it comes to the nuclear capability of the country, about which so much talk is aired, not only do the submarines have to go to the United States regularly to be serviced because they operate this American technology and they're obliged to do it, the Americans have got the second key. The Brits cannot use their nuclear weapons independently. They've got the first key, but the Americans have got the second key. So it is preposterous. It's preposterous on economic terms. It's preposterous on military terms, as things stand. It's a disaster on the part of the Labour Party to watch them to move down that path. They were elected not so long ago. People expected something different. People expected something, some move towards a better arrangement for working people. It looks as if next to nothing will materialize from that, and we will move down the path of militarism, which will be disastrous for economy and for society.
I just want to give to our audience a sense of perspective here. The United Kingdom is reported to have the fifth largest military budget in the world, only behind the US, China, Russia, and Germany. Its military expenditures are estimated to be approximately 35% of those of China, which has, of course, a vastly bigger economy and a vastly bigger population. So I would have thought, Costas, that they're already in the UK, even despite the pathetic state of the UK's military, from a military expenditure perspective, they're already punching well above their weight. And a sensible approach would be dramatic reductions in military expenditure in the UK, or at a bare minimum, finding ways to make better use of the money they're spending, because clearly that money is not being spent wisely. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think that's a very powerful point, because if you add the military expenditure of the Western powers without the United States, if you add the military expenditure of those powers, in other words, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and so on, if you add that expenditure, it's already a multiple of the Russian expenditure on an annual basis. They already spend much more than Russia does if you put them all together. So it's not true that we in Europe have not been spending money on weapons, whereas the Russians have been arming themselves and have been, and so that's just not true. It appears, however, that in Europe, and also the United States here, which is the champion spender, right? The United States spends about $1 trillion a year, dollars on arms. It appears that most of this spending has been to maintain large layers of privileged people in the state to which they've been accustomed. It appears that there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of waste in the use of that money. And it certainly seems that these very powerful states are not getting enough bang for the buck, even the United States. So you're talking here about one of the worst cases of mismanagement of public resources on a gigantic scale. And what's going to happen now is going to be even worse. It's going to be even worse. There is no evidence that things are going to be better as a result in Europe.
Yeah, the UK and Germany alone spend collectively $167 billion. And the Russian military budget, and this is a wartime budget, Russia's reoriented its economy to sustain a war, which is effectively a war against NATO. It's 146 billion. So even the UK and Germany substantially surpass. I mean, it doesn't include France, it doesn't include Poland, it doesn't include all the other NATO members. And they're telling us they need to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP. It's just absolutely boggles the mind that people don't, go out into the streets and just express their outrage at this lunacy and how we're all being pilfered and raped and pillaged by the military-industrial complex. I just had to get that off my chest, Costas.
It's extraordinary. It's quite simply extraordinary, especially in Europe, where the European elites seem to have lost all sense of measure. They're running around like headless chickens. They're making all these warlike noises, and they're making announcements about economic activity and economic measures to be taken as a result of geopolitical developments, which make no sense at all. Germany is also proposing something extraordinary. 500 billion euros expenditure plan for the military primarily, not only but primarily for the military. Ursula von der Leyen, of the EU, the commission head of the EU, she's planning to spend. She's announced 800 billion. We don't know how much there is actually in reality, but that's a huge amount of money. Whichever way you look at it, borrowed a lot of it, but anyway, it's a huge amount of money. For what? As you say yourself, the entire expenditure of the Russians is 140 billion, and we already surpass it. Now, simply to increase the military expenditure, in the case of Britain, it will cause a social disaster, an economic disaster, as I've pointed out. Elsewhere, it will just cause tremendous social disruption across Europe. The end result will not be a European army. Such a thing doesn't exist, and it will never exist. Armies are not created by adding up different nationalities under arms, right? There is no such thing as a European army if you add the French to the Germans to the British. This doesn't amount to a European army. What will happen if this remilitarization comes to pass is the emergence of powerful national armies in Europe at the cost of their own societies. That's what's going to happen. And the most powerful of them all will be the German army. So it looks as if what's happening in Europe in the most thoughtless fashion is that policies are put in train that will result in Germany re-emerging as the country with the most powerful army in Europe. Now, I don't think that's a very wise thing to aim for. Be careful what you wish for. A remilitarized Germany run by conservatives with a strong far right in the political spectrum and a strong army, it doesn't look to me as if this is a guarantee of stability and a guarantee of democracy and everything else in the future.
Besides which, I thought that this was precisely what the European Union was designed to avoid. But in any event, the reemergence of a militaristic Germany in the heart of Europe. So lastly, Costas, I'd like to talk to you about a very specific category of military expenditure that the West has been engaged in over the past 3 years, and that's loans for militarizing or arming Ukraine. And it's just something that I don't understand, and I was hoping you'd be able to explain it to me. So last month, the Trudeau government, which had already provided nearly $20 billion in military and economic aid to Ukraine, announced that Canada is dispersing the first installment of 5 billion Canadian dollar to Ukraine as part of the G7's $50 billion loan to Ukraine. And the Trudeau government said, when it announced this 5 billion Canadian dollar loan, that the G7 loan is being shouldered mainly by the US and the EU and will be repaid by proceeds from roughly $300 billion in Russian assets held in Western bank accounts. And I understand that the Starmer government has also just announced something very similar. It's extending what it describes as a loan to Ukraine for purposes of military, purchasing munitions and other military equipment, and that it's going to be repaid out of the interest earned on these seized Russian assets being held in Western financial institutions. So what I don't get, Costas, is why are they structuring the transaction in this way? If they think that they have the legal authority to seize those funds, why don't they just take them and grant them outright to Ukraine? Why are they calling them loans and then hoping that one day Ukraine is going to pay them back? And by the way, is there any prospect that Ukraine is going to ever be able to pay that money back?
There are two issues here, which are related, but are also independent from one another. The first is providing resources to Ukraine as the side that has been fighting for us, right? Meaning the West. And the second is using the sequestered Russian money, which is basically Russian foreign exchange reserves, kept mostly with European private banks. These are not necessarily connected to one another, although the policies proposed by European governments and sometimes by US officials want to connect them. Now, Ukraine will discover at the end of this that the largesse of the West is not what it was supposed to be. Like all people who fight for the West, at some point they realize that they're not our friends and they're not providing resources for nothing. And this also happens within the West, incidentally. The United States financed Britain when Britain fought the Second World War. It relied on US finance almost fully. And at the end of that, Britain realized that United States finance meant the end of its hegemony in the world market, in the world. That's basically what it amounted to. Ukraine will realize that the loans that he has been provided with, to a certain extent, we don't know exactly what it is because they've been keeping these terms opaque. The loans that they've been provided with were not beneficial to Ukraine, and its resources will be made available to Western interests. I'm prepared to bet a large amount of money on this, that at the end of this war, Ukraine will realize that it hasn't simply lost hundreds of thousands of young people. It hasn't simply seen its large cities to be destroyed and its economy to be damaged severely, but it's also in hoc to Western powers, and something that will only be paid through committing its resources for the indefinite future, paying the lender, rather than using those resources for the well-being of its own people. Now, using the Russian money is, of course, not connected necessarily to that. This is an idea that keeps coming up. Let's use that money because Russia is the aggressor and so on. There's all kinds of ideological stuff that goes with it. Sure. The only problem is that this is theft. And the simplest way of putting it is that this is theft. And legally, it is theft, and it is very easy for Russia to show it that it is theft. There's no question. You can moralize about it. You can call Putin a thug. You can say that Russia is the aggressor. You can find all kinds of moral arguments about it, but the reality remains that it is theft. And if you've got theft of this type, and it is actually undertaken by official agencies, as it would be in this case, then you're undermining the credibility of your own financial system dramatically. That's basically what's underneath this. They know that if they do this with the Russian money, then they're signaling to everybody else in the world who keeps reserves in dollars or in euros, perhaps, and keeps those with Western banks, that they are taking their own future in their own hands. There's no guarantee that this will be paid back whole. That's basically what they're telling me. And if there is geopolitical tension, then the West will take that money. That is not something you want to do when you've got international finance. That is no basis on which to operate. And it is actually international financial enterprises that have been against it. They don't want to see it because they know that this undermines the credibility of the system as a whole. So that's the overall situation. Now, they've been using the interest already. They've been doing that because they think that this is theft, but not very much. It's like the foolish, it's like the foolish woman in the Bible, that she was pregnant, but it was only a small baby, right? And in this case, it's theft, but it's not very much. We're only stealing the interest. What the West, the Russians will do about that when the situation is over remains to be seen. But they've got a very strong case. They've got a very strong case, legal case, certainly on the principle, and potentially on the interest. So all suggestions that this should happen en masse, very badly founded, if founded at all, and very risky for the financial system as a whole.
Yeah. And I just want to say, Costas, for the benefit of those who may recoil at the idea that this is theft. And what I'm about to say, I don't want anybody to misunderstand that I'm drawing an equivalence between the Iraq War and the Ukraine War. These are very different wars that happen for very different reasons. But any objective observer would acknowledge that the war in Iraq was a criminal war of aggression. Did any Western government propose that we should seize assets held by the United States and private financial institutions in order to pay reparations to Iraq? To my knowledge, not a single Western government, or indeed, I don't think any government on God's green earth proposed that that take place, even though it is now clear beyond a shadow of a doubt that that was a criminal war of aggression. So I too agree, and as a lawyer, from a lawyer's perspective, Costas, I'm very concerned about the implications of stealing this money for the global financial system and the rule of law generally. Something which the West is, of course, telling us it's constantly upholding the rule of law.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And as I say, the more, the wiser, more sagacious members of the Western establishment understand this. It's only the wilder people and the European elites who seem to have lost all sense of proportion that are talking seriously about that. I don't think they will do it. But if they do, it is bound to have negative implications for those who will do it
Right.
in the longer run. It is bound to do so.
Well, as always, Costas, fascinating to speak with you. A great pleasure. And I look forward to our next conversation on the Global Economy Report.
It's my pleasure to talk to you. And I also look forward to our next discussion.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on March 12, 2025.